The doors to the Supreme Council Hall stretched 20 meters high, carved from a single piece of crystalline metal that hummed with energy patterns older than human civilization. Ambassador Jake Sullivan felt the weight of 10,000 years of galactic politics pressing down on him, as those massive barriers slid open with a sound like breaking thunder. Behind him, his small diplomatic team walked in perfect formation: General Lisa Park, Chief Negotiator Tom Rivers, and Strategic Advisor Amy Chen, taking measured steps that echoed through corridors lined with the flags of 1,000 worlds. The council chamber beyond defied every expectation Jake had built during their journey to the galactic capital. The room curved upward into darkness, its walls alive with shifting patterns that seemed to pulse with the heartbeats of the assembled representatives. Floating platforms arranged in concentric circles held delegates from species so alien that Jake's mind struggled to process them as living beings. Some were crystalline structures that communicated through color changes. Others appeared to be living gas clouds contained within mechanical suits. Many defied any earthly comparison. At the chamber's heart sat the High Council, 12 beings whose species had ruled the galaxy since before Earth's sun had formed planets. Their thrones rose like monuments to power, each one unique to its occupant's biology, but all radiating the same unmistakable authority. Chancellor Vex of the Dominion Alliance leaned forward. His forearms spread wide in a gesture that somehow managed to convey both welcome and warning. His scaled hide bore the scars of a dozen conquered worlds, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had never met an equal. The delegation from the young world designated as Earth, Chancellor Vex announced, his voice carrying clearly through translation devices that had been perfected when humanity was still discovering fire. You stand before the Supreme Council of Worlds to answer for the violations committed by your species in the Outer Rim territories. Jake felt the weight of 1,000 alien gazes upon him. 3 months ago, human colony ships had established settlements in what they believed was empty space. Those settlements had apparently violated treaties that humanity had never seen, agreements made by species they had never contacted, governing territories they had never known existed. Honored Chancellor, Jake replied, his voice steady despite the enormity of what they faced. We come seeking understanding. The territories in question showed no signs of habitation or prior claim according to our surveys. A ripple of what might have been laughter passed through the assembled delegates. Chancellor Morgan of the ancient hegemony, whose species had achieved interstellar travel while humans were still living in caves, spoke with the patient tone usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to children. Your surveys, young ambassador, were conducted with technology we discarded as primitive before your star system had fully formed. The Outer Rim territories have been under protected development status for 8,000 years, designated as reserve space for species achieving their first interstellar expansion. Jake exchanged glances with General Park, who gave the slightest nod. They had expected this. Every human diplomat had studied the records of species who had encountered the Council before. Most had been absorbed into existing power structures, their independence traded for protection and guided development. A few had been relocated to designated worlds where they could grow under Council supervision. None had ever been granted true equality. We appreciate the Council's long stewardship of galactic territories, Jake continued. However, we were not informed of these protections. We acted in good faith based on the information available to us. Chancellor Vex, whose crystalline form sparkled with what could have been amusement, spoke in harmonious tones that the translators rendered as barely concealed condescension. Information, Ambassador Sullivan, is provided to species when they demonstrate the wisdom to use it properly. Your civilization has exhibited concerning patterns of aggressive expansion, territorial disputes, and environmental destruction. The Council questions whether humanity possesses the maturity for unrestricted galactic citizenship. The accusation hung in the air like a physical thing. Jake had prepared for this moment, studying every detail of humanity's first contact protocols, every precedent set by species who had come before. What he said next would determine whether humanity joined the galactic community as an equal partner or as a supervised dependency. With respect, Chancellor Vex, we would argue that humanity's very presence here demonstrates exactly the maturity you question. Jake's voice carried a new note of confidence that made several council members shift in their seats. We detected your monitoring stations in our system 18 months before our colony ships departed. We knew we were being watched. Silence fell across the chamber like a blanket. Chancellor Vex's scaled features shifted into what might have been surprise, while Morgan's ancient eyes narrowed with sudden interest. "Impossible," declared Chancellor Rex, whose mechanical voice carried absolute certainty. "Our observation technology is undetectable to pre-galactic civilizations. Your instruments lack the sophistication to identify quantum masking fields." General Park stepped forward, her military bearing unmistakable even among beings who had never seen a human soldier. "You're correct, Chancellor. Our instruments alone were insufficient, but our analysis methods were more than adequate once we began looking for the right patterns." Tom Rivers activated a small device, and holographic displays materialized throughout the chamber, despite what should have been absolute council control over the facility's systems. The images showed detailed scans of the observation stations, complete with technical specifications that made several council members visibly recoil. "We've been studying your monitoring networks for over a year," Tom explained with the calm precision of someone revealing a perfectly played hand. "Not just the stations themselves, but the technology behind them, the civilizations that built them, and the political structures that deploy them." Amy Chen moved to Jake's other side, her expression carrying the dangerous calm of someone who had spent months preparing for this exact moment. "We know about the resource extraction protocols hidden in your development assistance programs. We know about the artificial scarcity policies that keep younger species dependent on council guidance. We know about the territorial redistribution agreements that your member species sign without understanding their full implications." The chamber erupted into chaos as delegates began communicating rapidly in frequencies beyond human hearing. Emergency alerts chimed through systems that the council had believed were completely secure. On the viewing screens surrounding the Great Hall, warning indicators began flashing as station sensors detected energy signatures that shouldn't have been possible. Chancellor Vex's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "What have you done?" Jake smiled, and for the first time since entering the chamber, he looked like exactly what he was, a representative of a species that had clawed its way to the stars through intelligence, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. "We've leveled the playing field, Chancellor. While you were watching us through your hidden stations, we were watching you. While you were debating our fitness for galactic citizenship, we were learning everything we could about the system we were being invited to join." The ambassador paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the assembled representatives. "You wanted to test humanity's maturity, Chancellors. Consider this our final examination." Outside the council station, where there had been empty space moments before, the shadows of human vessels began to materialize against the stars. The test was far from over, but the rules had just changed completely. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity had not come seeking permission to join their civilization. They had come to transform it. The emergency alerts continued cascading through the council chamber as more human vessels revealed themselves in impossible positions around the galactic capital. Ambassador Jake Sullivan watched the color drain from Chancellor Vex's scaled features while tactical displays showed readings that defied every strategic assumption the council had held for millennia. "How many ships?" Chancellor Morgan's ancient voice carried a tremor that spoke to fears older than recorded history. "General." Lisa Park consulted her data pad with the calm precision of someone who had spent months planning for this exact scenario. "Enough, Chancellor. More than enough to ensure this conversation proceeds on equal terms." The implications hit the assembled delegates like a physical blow. Every species that had ever approached the council had done so as supplicants, arriving in small diplomatic vessels that posed no threat to the massive defense networks protecting the galactic capital. Humanity had not only detected those defenses but had somehow positioned a fleet to bypass them entirely. Chancellor Thex's crystalline form sparked, with patterns that the translators rendered as barely controlled panic. "This is an act of war. You have violated the sovereignty of the galactic capital with military forces." "Have we?" Tom Rivers asked, his diplomatic training allowing him to sound genuinely curious rather than threatening. "According to the territorial agreements we accessed from your own databases, the space around this station is designated as neutral territory where all galactic citizens may freely navigate. We're simply exercising rights that you've already granted us." Amy Chen activated additional displays, showing legal documents that several council members clearly recognized. Article 15 of the Galactic Navigation Accords. Any species granted preliminary citizenship status may position defensive forces in neutral territories during formal diplomatic proceedings. You wrote the law, Chancellors. We're simply following it. The chamber fell into a silence that spoke to centuries of carefully maintained control suddenly slipping away. Chancellor Rex's mechanical components whirred as he processed the full scope of what humanity had accomplished. Preliminary citizenship was granted as a formality, he stated, his artificial voice carrying notes of disbelief. A gesture of goodwill while your species underwent evaluation. It was never intended to be exercised. Jake stepped forward, his diplomatic composure hiding the satisfaction of a plan executing perfectly. Intent and implementation are different things, Chancellor. When the Council granted us preliminary status, you opened legal pathways that your own bureaucracy had apparently forgotten existed. The ambassador gestured toward the tactical displays, showing human vessels maintaining perfect formation around the station. Every ship you see is operating within the legal framework you established. Every action we've taken follows protocols that have been part of galactic law for thousands of years. The only difference is that no species has ever been organized enough to use them. General Park moved to one of the chamber's massive viewing ports, where the assembled delegates could see the scope of humanity's coordination. Your monitoring stations gave us excellent intelligence on Council defensive capabilities. Your observation protocols showed us exactly how to approach this facility without triggering automatic responses. Your own security procedures provided the roadmap for everything we've accomplished. Chancellor Morgan leaned forward, his ancient eyes showing something that might have been respect mixed with growing alarm. You studied us as carefully as we studied you. More carefully, Tom Rivers confirmed. We had 18 months to prepare while you've had millions of years to grow comfortable with unchallenged authority. Comfort breeds predictability, Chancellors, and predictability can be exploited. Amy Chen pulled up another series of displays that made several council members visibly flinch. The images showed detailed intelligence on council operations that should have been absolutely classified. Internal communications, resource allocation reports, strategic planning documents that revealed the true nature of galactic governance. We know about the marginal world protocols, she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The systematic impoverishment of newly discovered species to ensure they remain dependent on council guidance. We know about the technology restriction agreements that prevent developing civilizations from achieving true independence. The evidence was overwhelming, and worse, it was being simultaneously broadcast to every civilized world in the galaxy. Council members watched in horror as their most carefully guarded secrets were exposed to populations who had only heard sanitized versions of galactic politics. Chancellor Vex's voice carried a note of desperation. These operations are necessary for galactic stability. Young species require guidance to prevent the conflicts that nearly destroyed civilization millions of years ago. Whose conflicts? Jake asked, his tone carrying the sharp edge of a prosecutor addressing a defendant. The historical records we accessed show that nearly every major galactic war in the past million years was triggered by council policies. Resource disputes caused by artificial scarcity, territorial conflicts manufactured to justify intervention, technological restrictions that force species to compete for limited opportunities. General Park turned from the viewing port, her expression grim. The pattern is consistent across every era. The Council creates problems, then positions itself as the only solution, but the solutions always require surrendering more autonomy, more resources, more freedom to species that are supposedly being helped. Tom Rivers activated one final display that showed the true scope of humanity's investigation. We've spent 18 months not just studying your technology and defenses, but analyzing the social and economic structures that maintain your power. The conclusion is unavoidable. The Council doesn't preserve galactic peace. You prevent it. The chamber erupted as delegates began rapid communications in frequencies that human equipment shouldn't have been able to detect. But Amy Chen's equipment was detecting them, translating them, and broadcasting the contents to the general galactic population in real time. Emergency session requested by the Dominion Alliance, she announced, reading from intercepted transmissions. Proposal to invoke military emergency protocols and classify humanity as a hostile force. Suggested response includes immediate containment and forced relocation to a supervised world. Chancellor Thex's crystalline form pulsed with rapid color changes. Those communications are classified beyond your clearance level. Were classified, Jake corrected. Past tense. Along with approximately 40% of the Council's operational database. Amazing what you can accomplish when a species dedicates its best minds to understanding the systems they're being asked to join. The implications were staggering. Humanity hadn't just prepared for this diplomatic meeting. They had conducted the most comprehensive intelligence operation in galactic history. While the Council had been watching human colonies and assessing their potential threat, human agents had been systematically mapping the political, economic, and military structures that maintained galactic civilization. Chancellor Rex's mechanical voice carried new notes of what might have been admiration. The scope of your operation, it would require resources and coordination beyond what any pre-galactic civilization has ever achieved. General Park smiled with the satisfaction of someone revealing a perfectly executed strategy. You're operating under a false assumption, Chancellor. We're not a pre-galactic civilization. We've been galactic citizens since the moment you granted us preliminary status. We simply chose to exercise those rights in ways you didn't anticipate. Jake moved to the center of the chamber, his presence now clearly that of an equal addressing peers, rather than a petitioner seeking favor. The question before this council is no longer whether humanity deserves galactic citizenship. The question is whether this council deserves to continue governing a galaxy that has clearly outgrown its methods. Outside the chamber, more vessels continued to arrive, not just human ships, but transports carrying journalists, legal observers, and representatives from species that had been silenced for generations. The greatest diplomatic crisis in galactic history was unfolding in real time, broadcast to every civilized world. The age of unchallenged council authority was ending. The age of true galactic democracy was about to begin, and humanity had just announced their intention to midwife that transition, whether the council cooperated or not. The tactical display surrounding the council chamber painted a picture that redefined the concept of impossible. Real-time feeds from across the galaxy showed simultaneous uprisings on dozens of worlds, coordinated with precision that spoke to months of careful planning. Ambassador Jake Sullivan watched. Chancellor Vex's scaled features contort with disbelief as reports continued flooding in from every corner of council space. Nexus Prime is reporting massive civil unrest in all major population centers, Chancellor Morgan announced, his ancient voice heavy with the weight of crumbling certainty. The protesters have detailed intelligence on our security protocols. They're bypassing defenses that were considered unbreachable. General Lisa Park nodded with grim satisfaction. The same intelligence we used to position our fleet, Chancellor. Amazing what happens when oppressed populations finally receive the tools they need to resist effectively. Chancellor Rex's mechanical systems sparked as priority alerts overwhelmed his processing capacity. Impossible. The Keth resistance was crushed decades ago. Their leadership was scattered across a dozen prison worlds. The leadership you knew about, Tom Rivers corrected, his diplomatic training barely concealing the satisfaction of a perfectly executed revelation. The ones who allowed themselves to be seen. The actual Keth command structure has been operating from mobile bases in the Drift Nebula since your pacification campaign began. Amy Chen activated new displays that showed the true scope of what the council faced. Every uprising, every act of resistance, every coordinated strike against council authority was being executed with intelligence that should have been impossible for subjugated species to obtain. 3 years ago, we began reaching out to species that had been absorbed into your empire, she explained, her voice carrying the weight of a prosecutor presenting damning evidence, not through official diplomatic channels, but through the underground networks that always exist when people are denied their freedom. The chamber's viewing ports offered a perspective that drove home the magnitude of the crisis. Ships bearing the insignia of a dozen supposedly pacified species were taking positions alongside human vessels. The site represented something that had never existed in galactic history, a unified resistance movement spanning multiple civilizations. Chancellor Thex's crystalline form pulsed with rapid color changes that the translators rendered as barely controlled panic. The resource extraction facilities on Valdris Prime are under attack. The assault teams have detailed schematics of installations that were classified beyond their security clearance. Were classified, Jake emphasized. moving closer to the council thrones with the confidence of someone holding unbeatable cards. Amazing what you can discover when you start asking the right questions, like why the Valdris extraction quotas increased by 300% after their resistance movement was supposedly eliminated. General Park gestured toward displays, showing economic data that made several council members visibly recoil, or why the Keth homeworld's agricultural output was redirected to feed core worlds while their own population faced rationing, or why 17 different species were forced to compete for the same mining rights instead of being allowed to develop alternative economic models. The pattern was devastating in its clarity. Every policy the Council had implemented to maintain stability had actually created the conditions for revolution. By forcing species into artificial competition, denying them technological development, and maintaining their dependence through carefully managed scarcity, the Council had built a galaxy-spanning powder keg. Tom Rivers activated communication feeds that showed the revolution's scope in real time. The Free Worlds Coalition formally declares its independence from Council authority. Current membership includes 47 species across 12 sectors. They're establishing their own communication networks, trade agreements, and mutual defense pacts. Chancellor Morgan's ancient eyes showed something approaching terror. Without central coordination, the economic infrastructure will collapse. Billions will die in the chaos. The infrastructure that funneled 80% of galactic wealth to 12 core worlds while keeping everyone else in perpetual poverty? Amy Chen asked, her voice carrying sharp disbelief. That infrastructure is already collapsed, Chancellor. We're simply building something better from the wreckage. The evidence continued mounting as more reports flooded in. Species that had been enemies for generations were cooperating in ways that defied every assumption about galactic politics. The Valdris were sharing their advanced sensor technology with former hegemony worlds. The Keth had established joint mining operations with species they had never been allowed to contact. Independent colonies were forming economic partnerships that bypassed council taxation entirely. Chancellor Vex leaned forward, his forearms spread in a gesture that might have been pleading. This alliance cannot last. Species have conflicting interests, resource needs, territorial disputes, without a central authority to mediate. Without a central authority manufacturing those conflicts to justify its own existence, Jake interrupted. Yes, we know. Amazing what species can accomplish when they're not being deliberately kept in competition with each other. General Park moved to another viewing port where the assembled delegates could see construction. Vessels already beginning work on new infrastructure. The resource distribution networks you're seeing established right now are based on cooperative principles rather than extraction quotas. Species sharing technology freely instead of having it rationed by authorities who never developed it themselves. The implications were staggering. Humanity hadn't just organized a revolution. They had provided the framework for a completely new model of galactic civilization. One based on voluntary cooperation rather than imposed order, mutual benefit rather than hierarchical control. Chancellor Rex's artificial voice carried notes of desperate calculation. The logistical requirements alone. Coordinating resistance movements across dozens of star systems, establishing secure communications, providing technological support to primitive species. The resources required would be enormous. Tom Rivers smiled with the satisfaction of someone revealing the final piece of a complex puzzle. You're operating under another false assumption, Chancellor. We didn't provide the resources. We provided the coordination. Every species we contacted already possessed the capabilities they needed for resistance. They simply lacked the information and coordination to use them effectively. Amy Chen pulled up displays showing the true genius of humanity's approach. The Keth didn't need our ships, and they had been building their own fleet in secret for decades. The Valdris didn't require our weapons. They had been stockpiling captured council technology since their supposed defeat. The independent colonies weren't dependent on our support. They had been preparing for this opportunity for generations. Jake moved to the center of the chamber, his presence now unmistakably that of someone announcing the end of an era. Every species you subjugated retained the memory of freedom. Every world you occupied harbored populations that never accepted their subjugation. Every economic restriction you imposed created underground networks dedicated to bypassing your authority. The ambassador paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the killing blow. You didn't rule a stable galaxy, Chancellors. You ruled a galaxy-spanning prison where the inmates were simply waiting for someone to provide the keys. Chancellor Thex's crystalline form had stopped pulsing entirely, the light within seeming to dim as the magnitude of their situation became clear. What happens now? General Park consulted her datapad, reading reports that confirmed the scope of the transformation already underway. Now you face the judgment of the species you've oppressed. Real trials, with evidence presented publicly, judged by representatives of the civilizations you've wronged. Tom Rivers nodded grimly. No closed sessions, no diplomatic immunity, no secret agreements to make the inconvenience disappear. The galaxy is about to learn the true cost of your version of peace. Outside the chamber, the stars themselves seemed to be shifting as hundreds of vessels representing dozens of species took up positions around the council station. The greatest seat of power in galactic civilization had become its courtroom, watched over by the very beings they had sought to control. The age of the council was ending, not with conquest, but with revelation. And the galaxy was about to discover what justice looked like when administered by its victims rather than its oppressors. The Grand Council chamber had been transformed beyond recognition. Where once alien overlords had dispensed judgment from towering thrones, transparent holding cells now contained the former rulers of galactic civilization. The bioluminescent walls still pulsed with ancient patterns, but now they reflected the heartbeats of species that had never before been allowed to participate in galactic governance. Chief Justice Elena Voss stood before the assembled tribunal, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 years as a political prisoner before humanity's intervention had freed her from council detention. Around her, representatives from over 100 species worked through the complex process of conducting the largest war crimes trial in galactic history. The charges against the former council are unprecedented in scope, Justice Voss announced, her words translated simultaneously into every known language. Systematic oppression spanning millions of years, economic exploitation affecting billions of sentient beings, the deliberate suppression of technological and cultural development for entire civilizations. Former Chancellor Vex sat in his transparent cell, his scaled features showing the strain of facing judgment from species he had considered beneath notice just months ago. Beside him, Chancellor Morgan's ancient form seemed diminished, while Chancellor Rex's mechanical components had been reduced to basic life support functions. Ambassador Jake Sullivan watched the proceedings from the observer's gallery, no longer wearing the diplomatic uniform that had marked him as a petitioner before the council. Around him, beings from species that had suffered under council rule for generations bore witness to something that had seemed impossible just a year ago, their oppressors facing real consequences for their actions. The first witness took the stand, a Keth survivor whose homeworld had been strip-mined to provide resources for core world expansion projects through translation devices that now included every language rather than just council-approved tongues. His testimony painted a picture of systematic devastation disguised as development assistance. They told us the mining operations would bring prosperity to our people, the witness stated, his voice carrying the weight of profound loss. Instead, they poisoned our water, destroyed our agricultural zones, and left us dependent on imported food that we could barely afford with the wages they paid for our own resources. General Lisa Park, now serving as Chief Military Advisor to the Transitional Authority, presented evidence that had been compiled over months of investigation. Council records show that Keth homeworld resources were valued at over 40 trillion galactic credits. The Keth people received less than 2% of that value in compensation and development assistance. The pattern repeated across dozens of worlds and hundreds of species. The Valdris had seen their advanced sensor technology confiscated under non-proliferation agreements, only to have it sold to core world corporations at enormous profit. The marginal colonies had been denied access to medical technologies that could have prevented millions of deaths, because such technologies might reduce their dependence on council-approved healthcare systems. Tom Rivers, now serving as chief prosecutor, presented communications intercepts that revealed the cynical calculations behind council policies. Internal memo from Chancellor Vex to the Resource Management Committee, dated 3 years ago. The Outer Rim territories show signs of developing independent economic networks. Recommend implementing emergency scarcity protocols to maintain dependency ratios. The evidence was overwhelming, but worse than the scope of the crimes was the casual indifference with which they had been committed. Council records spoke of entire civilizations as resource allocation problems to be solved, rather than sentient beings with rights and dignity. Amy Chen, leading the Economic Reconstruction Committee, presented data showing the true cost of council rule. Galactic productivity was artificially suppressed by an estimated 60% through technology restrictions alone. If developing species had been allowed to advance naturally, current galactic civilization would be approximately 2,000 years more advanced than it actually is. Former Chancellor Morgan finally spoke from his holding cell, his ancient voice carrying a note of defensive justification. The restrictions prevented wars. Without central coordination, species develop weapons they cannot control. We maintained peace. Justice Voss fixed him with a stare that carried the weight of decades of suffering. Peace for whom, Chancellor? The core worlds that received the benefits of galactic exploitation? Or the billions of beings who lived in artificial poverty to maintain your version of stability? The tribunal moved through weeks of testimony, each day revealing new layers of systematic oppression that had been disguised as benevolent governance. But the most damning evidence came from the Council's own archives, which showed the deliberate nature of policies designed to keep species weak and dependent. Dr. Sarah Kim, humanity's chief xenopsychologist, presented analysis that cut to the heart of the Council's methods. The pattern is consistent across every era of Council rule. Promising species are identified early and subjected to what the records call developmental intervention. This intervention always results in technological stagnation, economic dependency, and political fragmentation. Jake watched as representatives from victim species confronted their former oppressors with evidence of crimes that spanned millennia. The process was cathartic but also necessary. The galaxy needed to understand exactly what had been done in the name of order and stability. The economic testimony proved particularly devastating. Council policies had created artificial scarcity in resources that were actually abundant, forced competition between species that should have been natural allies, and maintained technological restrictions that had no justification beyond preserving existing power structures. The Hegemony Accords of 2.7 million years ago, presented by economic analyst David Park, established resource quotas that were ostensibly designed to prevent overconsumption. In reality, they ensured that developing species could never accumulate enough surplus to fund independent research or military development. General Park presented military evidence that showed how Council peacekeeping forces had consistently intervened in conflicts only after ensuring maximum damage to all participants. The Valdres-Keth border wars were allowed to continue for 3 centuries, despite Council forces being capable of ending them within months. Internal records show this was deliberate policy to prevent either species from emerging as a potential threat. The pattern was clear and damning. The Council hadn't prevented wars. They had managed them to ensure maximum weakening of potential rivals while maintaining their own position as the only source of stability. Former Chancellor Thex attempted a defense based on galactic stability, but the evidence against such claims was overwhelming. You speak of preventing chaos, Justice Voss replied during cross-examination. But your own records show that Council policies created more conflicts than they resolved. Tom Rivers presented the final piece of evidence, communication records showing that the Council had been planning the complete elimination of humanity as a potential threat. The containment protocols weren't emergency measures. They were the culmination of a systematic plan to prevent any species from achieving true galactic citizenship. The verdict was delivered after 6 weeks of testimony. Guilty on all charges, Justice Voss announced. The evidence shows systematic crimes against civilization spanning millions of years. The sentences will reflect both the scope of these crimes and the need for restorative justice. Jake smiled as he watched the proceedings conclude. The sentences weren't about revenge. They were about making the former tyrants understand the consequences of their actions by forcing them to help repair the damage they had caused. Former Chancellor Vex would spend his remaining years assisting reconstruction efforts on worlds devastated by hegemony policies. Chancellor Morgan would work to restore archaeological sites destroyed during development projects. Chancellor Rex would help rebuild the communication networks his policies had restricted. But the real victory wasn't the punishment of the guilty. It was the proof that justice was possible when administered by the victims rather than the perpetrators. The galaxy was learning that accountability was not just a human concept. It was a universal principle that had simply been waiting for someone brave enough to enforce it. 2 years had passed since the fall of the Galactic Council, and the former Grand Chamber now hosted something that would have been unthinkable under the old regime, a true democratic assembly where species that had been enemies for millennia worked together to build a better galaxy. The circular arrangement of equal seats bore no resemblance to the towering thrones that had once dominated the space, and the bioluminescent walls pulsed with the heartbeats of beings who participated as equals rather than subjects. Jake Sullivan stood at the center of the chamber, but he no longer held the title of ambassador. By unanimous vote of the Free Worlds Alliance, he had been elected as the first Director General of the new galactic government, a position that carried significant responsibility but limited power. The structure had been designed to prevent the concentration of authority that had enabled the Council's abuses. The final report on reconstruction efforts, he announced, his voice carrying easily through translation networks that now included every known language and several that had been considered extinct under Council rule. 347 worlds have completed transition to self-governance. Resource redistribution programs have eliminated artificial scarcity in 92% of former Council territories. Technological sharing initiatives have advanced average galactic civilization by approximately 200 years. The assembled delegates represented a transformation that went far beyond political structures. Species that had been forced into artificial competition under Council rule now collaborated on projects that benefited everyone. The Keth had shared their agricultural innovations with former enemies, ending food scarcity on dozens of worlds. The Valdris had opened their sensor technology to all Alliance members, creating communication networks that spanned the galaxy without central control. Director of Science Dr. Elena Torres presented the latest technological assessment. Unrestricted research cooperation has produced advances that dwarf anything achieved under Council limitations. Interstellar travel time has been reduced by 60%. Medical technologies have eliminated 17 major diseases. Environmental restoration techniques have reversed centuries of exploitation damage. The economic transformation had been equally dramatic. General Lisa Park, now serving as Director of Resource Coordination, showed data that would have been impossible under the old system. Galactic productivity has increased by 300% since the elimination of artificial scarcity policies. Every Alliance member world now maintains strategic reserves of essential resources. Trade volumes have increased while economic inequality has decreased across all sectors. But the most significant change wasn't visible in statistics or technological advances. It was the fundamental shift in how galactic civilization approached problems. Instead of imposed solutions backed by military force, the Alliance relied on negotiation, cooperation, and voluntary compliance. Chief Justice Elena Voss, now heading the Interspecies Court of Justice, presented the legal framework that had replaced Council edicts. The Universal Rights Charter has been ratified by 412 species. For the first time in galactic history, every sentient being possesses recognized rights that cannot be overridden by political convenience or economic necessity. Tom Rivers, serving as Director of Diplomatic Relations, showed how conflict resolution had evolved under the new system. Territorial disputes that would have festered for centuries under Council rule are now resolved through mediation within months. The key difference is that all parties participate, as equals rather than petitioners before an imperial authority. Jake looked around the chamber at representatives from species that had never before been allowed a voice in galactic governance. Former Council subjects now sat alongside beings from the core worlds, working together on challenges that affected everyone. The site represented something unprecedented in galactic history. True cooperation based on mutual respect rather than imposed hierarchy. Amy Chen, leading the Cultural Preservation Initiative, presented perhaps the most remarkable achievement of the new order. 47 languages that were considered extinct under Council standardization policies have been revived. 17 species have re-established cultural practices that were banned under stability maintenance regulations. Artistic and scientific exchange programs have created Renaissance movements on over 200 worlds. The transformation extended beyond politics and economics to touch the very soul of galactic civilization. Species were rediscovering their identities after generations of forced assimilation. Worlds were rebuilding environments that had been destroyed by extraction industries. Cultures that had been suppressed were flourishing in ways that enriched everyone. Dr. Marcus Webb, heading the Historical Research Commission, presented findings that put the Council's fall into broader context. Archaeological evidence shows that galactic civilization has experienced similar transitions approximately every 2 million years. Centralized authorities eventually become so rigid that they collapse under their own contradictions. What makes this transition unique is that we're consciously building systems designed to prevent future authoritarian consolidation. The alliance structure deliberately limited central authority while maintaining coordination mechanisms for galaxy-wide challenges. No single species could dominate decision-making. No permanent bureaucracy could accumulate excessive power. Regular rotation of leadership positions ensured that authority remained tied to competence, rather than political connections. Former Chancellor Vex, now working as a manual laborer on reconstruction projects, had become an unexpected symbol of the new order's approach to justice. His letters from the restoration site spoke to genuine remorse and understanding of the damage his policies had caused. I spent my career believing that order required hierarchy. One of his published reflections stated, I now understand that true order emerges from cooperation freely given rather than compliance forcibly extracted. The galaxy I helped build was not stable, it was stagnant. What we see emerging now is what civilized society actually looks like. General Park presented the security assessment that proved the new system's viability. Military conflicts have decreased by 80% since the alliance formation. When disputes do arise, they're resolved through economic and diplomatic pressure, rather than force. The absence of artificial scarcity has eliminated most causes of interspecies conflict. The military transformation reflected broader changes in galactic thinking. Instead of massive fleets designed to impose imperial will, the alliance maintained smaller mobile forces focused on disaster relief and peacekeeping. Former Council military personnel had largely transitioned to civilian roles in reconstruction and infrastructure development. Jake moved to the Chamber's central podium for his concluding remarks. 2 years ago, many predicted that the Council's fall would lead to chaos and fragmentation. Instead, we've seen cooperation on a scale that was impossible under authoritarian rule. The difference is simple. People work harder and more effectively when they're building something they choose to be part of, rather than something imposed upon them. The Director General paused, looking around at delegates who represented the hopes of trillions of beings across the galaxy. The Council's greatest error wasn't their corruption or their cruelty. It was their fundamental misunderstanding of what civilization means. They confused order with control, stability with stagnation, peace with submission. Through the Chamber's viewing ports, the assembled delegates could see the physical manifestation of their success. Construction vessels from dozens of species worked together on projects that benefited everyone. Trade ships moved freely along routes that were no longer subject to arbitrary restrictions. Communication arrays carried signals in hundreds of languages to worlds that had been isolated under Council rule. Today marks the 2nd anniversary of the Alliance Charter, Jake announced. More importantly, it marks the beginning of true galactic civilization, one based on the radical principle that all sentient beings deserve an equal voice in shaping their destiny. The Chamber erupted in celebration, but the sound was different from the formal approval that had characterized Council sessions. This was genuine enthusiasm for achievements that belonged to everyone rather than obedience to authority that served only the powerful. Outside the Chamber, the galaxy continued its work of building something unprecedented in its history, not an empire based on conquest or a bureaucracy based on control, but a true civilization based on cooperation freely given and justice fairly administered. The age of the Council was truly over. The age of the Alliance had begun, and across the galaxy in 1,000 different languages, the same phrase was being spoken with hope rather than fear. The future belongs to all of us. For the first time in galactic history, those words were actually true.